Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
I had an uncle, my dad's oldest brother. He was already old when I was a kid, and he died before I even finished middle school. I think he was kind of a fuck up because he lived with us for a while. Dad mentioned once that he somehow lost his house. Anyway, my uncle used to help my parents put me to bed by reading me scary stories out of this huge book. He claimed that it was his journal and that the stories were all true. I still remember a few, and I may as well share them because I love these threads and I want to keep it bumped. Just imagine you're 9 years old like I was, and you're shitting your pants as your uncle reads these. Uncle worked up north for a few years on a ranch. Seasonal work, spring through summer. Usually, sometimes years he'd work less, sometimes more. But he was always gone by fall. Every spring he'd return and find that the rancher's house had lots of damage. The two of them would fix it up, and then my uncle would stick around and help him around the ranch. One spring he came back and the rancher had a broken leg. The rancher said he fell off the roof while fixing it. He notices the house looks especially bad this year. It had a huge wraparound front porch, but it's been practically demolished. The rancher says a tree fell on it. There are no trees near the house. Rancher is out of commission due to the broken leg, so uncle has to repair the porch himself. Time passes and the rancher heals. One morning, uncle is helping around the ranch while the rancher goes off hunting. Everything's fine until uncle spots the rancher heading out of the woods. He's walking backwards, with his shotgun raised, aimed at the trees. Uncle immediately thinks, "Oh fuck, must be a mountain lion." He runs to his truck where his gun is, grabs the gun and rushes towards the rancher. As he's rushing over, he notes something bizarre. The grass is tall in that area, and it seems to be bending like there's a wild breeze, only there isn't one. Realizes that the grass is bending from the tree line towards the rancher, like someone is walking through it, only nobody's there. For some reason, this spooks my uncle so much that he yells out like a fucking barbarian. This startles the rancher and he fires off a round. Immediately, the grass stands back up like whatever was moving through it is gone. The rancher then runs back towards the house and tells my uncle to come inside. Uncle asks him what the hell that was, and the rancher is shaking like a leaf, saying,
"It was a mountain lion. It was a mountain lion."
My uncle's thinking bullshit. That would have had to be an invisible mountain lion. There wasn't an animal in sight. But the rancher looks mega spooked, so he drops it and the two calm their nerves over some whiskey. Uncle passes the summer on the ranch. He's waiting for the rancher to offer some explanation about what he saw. Never does. Before uncle leaves that summer, the rancher gives him a bonus and tells him he earned it. Fast forward. Fall and winter pass. Next spring, uncle returns to the ranch. He shows up and there's a crew doing repairs on the house. Uncle is confused. He knocks on the door and some young guy answers. Even more confused, uncle explains that he works there every spring and summer, and mentions the rancher's name. The nephew tells him he's the rancher's nephew, and that
the old man passed away, unfortunately.
Uncle is sad. What happened? Nephew shakes his head.
We don't know, but it looked like a mountain lion might have got him.
Uncle's blood runs cold. He recalls the weird event from the previous summer. In the house, he asks. The nephew shakes his head again.
We don't know.
That's it. The way my uncle said that last line always gave me shivers. Fuck it. I'll share another from my uncle's journal. It'll keep the thread bumped and maybe it'll entertain someone. In this story, uncle is a teenager back home in Alabama. Rural town, very racist, but the polite sort of racists from back in the day. The type filled with old people who'll use racial slurs without meaning nothing by it. Anyway, there's a woman whose family is a little nuts. They call her Elizabeth. Elizabeth has always been a little nuts herself, but the family's got money, so everyone treats her with respect. One day, her parents die on a trip out west. The family home passes to her sisters and to her. But not long after that, Elizabeth's sisters also die. No sign of any illness or anything, they just keel over one day. Everyone suspects the crazy girl poisoned her sisters. But since they can't prove anything, they have to let the matter drop. Gossip turns into folklore. Elizabeth is a witch. She killed her parents using black magic. And then she used it on her sisters too. Local kids tend to keep away from her house. They say she has the body of her lover tied up in her bed, and she sleeps with it at night. You see, before she went crazy, Elizabeth had a fiancé. He was just a local boy who came from nothing, but he had a knack for business and started up a factory of some sort. Money coming out of his sleeves, rags to riches story. But then Elizabeth's mind started to go, like a lot of other women in her family. Then the fiancé suddenly disappeared. Everyone had assumed he just couldn't stand to marry a lunatic, understandably, and hightailed it out of town. But after the parents died, the fiancé came back. He and Elizabeth were seen riding around together through town. There was talk of them getting married. This pissed most of the women off. They assumed the fiancé was taking advantage of the poor little crazy girl for her inheritance. But one day, the fiancé disappeared. For a while, people assumed he just decided against marrying Elizabeth after all. But like I said, the rumors turned vicious, and a story cropped up about Elizabeth killing her fiancé. They said she tied his corpse up to her bed and slept with it. Others said she put a spell on him to keep him alive, but essentially brains. And the two lovers would canoodle and kiss all night. Of course, Uncle was too smart for those old bedtime stories, and he used to make fun of his friends for believing in them. So they dared my uncle to go and sneak into Elizabeth's house. The night he went, it happened to storm earlier in the day, which sometimes caused the cemetery to stink for some reason. So here comes Uncle, dead of night, sneaking into Elizabeth's house in the pouring rain, with the smell of death and decay all around him. He managed to sneak in through a basement window. Then he skulked throughout the house, sopping wet and dripping water all over the place. The smell of death was strong even inside the house, which seemed odd. Soon, my uncle came up to the huge staircase leading upstairs. Of course, his friends had all wanted him to see if the fiancé's body was really in her room. That meant Uncle would have to climb the stairs to the top floor and sneak down the hall to the crazy girl's bedroom. He realized he was a little nervous, mainly because he didn't know if Elizabeth was one of them violent ones. But he wouldn't go back on a dare. So he tiptoed up the stairs and down the hall and towards the room. And he realized as he was approaching it that the smell of death and decay was getting worse. Then he heard a creak behind him and felt a heavy hand grip his shoulder. Much too heavy and much too large to be Elizabeth. Uncle froze. A deep voice behind him said,
"What are you doing, young man?"
Uncle turned around and it was an old man, dressed like a butler. Uncle had not even considered that Elizabeth had someone in the house helping her out. He jumped to escape the old man's grip, but the man's hand clamped down hard. Uncle struggled and kicked the shit out of the guy and ran down the stairs. Actually, the old man tried to chase him down the stairs, but, he's an old man. So my uncle escapes and runs all the way home in the pouring rain and the smell of death. He never manages to see whether there was a body in Elizabeth's room or not. But he told his friends all about how he had smelt the stench of decay coming from behind the door. They were all thoroughly impressed. Fast forward. Elizabeth died several years later. By then, Uncle had moved away from Alabama. He had just started helping out on that ranch I mentioned earlier, and one fall he comes back home to visit his folks and catch up with some old friends. Over some beers, he happens to mention the time he snuck into Elizabeth's house. His friends get real quiet. "What's wrong?" he asks. His friends explain to him in hushed voices that after Elizabeth died, the old butler had phoned her relatives in Louisiana. They came and took care of her funeral arrangements. Then Elizabeth was quickly buried and the house demolished. The following Sunday, the minister, the only person outside of the family who had been allowed to enter Elizabeth's room, gave a strange sermon. From the sound of it, it seemed to confirm all of the strange rumors about Elizabeth. But nobody to this day is sure. And the minister refused to ever talk about it.
My dad and Uncle Danny had a fucked up childhood. Grandpa was an abusive alcoholic. We used to wail on Dad and Uncle Danny all the time growing up. On Grandma too. One day Grandma got sick of all the beatings. Blew Grandpa away with a shotgun. Rip Gramps. Dad ended up pretty normal, but Uncle Danny is fucking nuts. Has always claimed that he could see ghosts and demons. He used to tell me that his ex-wife was a real-life witch. After they broke up, he started getting sick all the time. Dad said Uncle Danny blamed it on his witch ex-wife. He used to go to some healer to get protection from her. But he'd go through these periods of increased paranoia, saying she was coming after him. This always culminated in some sort of attack where Uncle Danny would be hospitalized. Doctors never found anything wrong, said it was likely just stress, and recommended meds. Uncle Danny never goes on meds though. Periods of paranoia would still hit every now and then, about twice a year maybe. Always ended with a hospitalization. His attacks usually happened in a public place, like a bar, where he'd start freaking out and claim she was after him. Then he'd go unconscious. Anyway, everyone just thought he was nuts, and Dad begged him to get on meds, but Uncle Danny absolutely refused. Kept going to the healer. One day, the guy straight up told Uncle Danny she's too strong for me and told Uncle Danny not to come back. So one night Uncle Danny is going especially nuts. Calls Dad up on the phone saying,
"She's coming after me. She wants to kill me."
Dad is freaked out, thinking his brother is going to have a fucking heart attack. Races over to his house in the middle of the night. Uncle Danny is holed up in his room, armed. He almost fucking shoots my dad when he comes through the door. He's almost incoherent, keeps babbling shit and saying,
"I'm going to die tonight."
Dad is pleading with him to put the gun down and leave the house with him, planning on trying to get him some help or something. Then he sees someone's shadow move past the window. A few seconds later, he hears the front door open and slammed shut. Thinks, oh fuck, this witch actually has been stalking my brother. Leaves the room to go confront her before realizing fuck, she's probably got a gun. But he never sees anybody. As soon as he leaves Uncle Danny in his room, the bedroom door slams shut. Dad tries to get back in, but the door is not budging. Then he hears some weird shit. First, Uncle Danny fires off a shot, but then it sounds like he's yanking the trigger, but the gun isn't firing. Uncle Danny starts screaming. Then there's a loud sound that visibly shakes the door. Then silence. Dad is finally able to open the door, and you can guess the rest. Rip Uncle Danny. His gun is still in his hand. He's got no wounds or scratches or anything on him. His eyes are wide open though. Looked like he just died of fucking fright. The worst part of my dad telling me this story was the way he described Uncle Danny's screams. Said it sounded like a baby crying.
I hadn't heard him scream like that since we were kids. Hello, this is my first time posting here, so I'm sorry if I'm doing things wrong. My girlfriend and I recently visited my family in Oregon. She hadn't met my parents yet, and we both wanted a break from the city. So we decided, why not? Let's have some fun in the country. My parents offered to let us stay in their guest house on Mount Hood. I declined and suggested to my girlfriend we stay in a hotel instead. She is a fan of the paranormal, and I knew she'd enjoy a stay in my hometown's famously haunted hotel. In fact, you can thank her for this post. She convinced me to tell my story here. To my surprise, she wanted to stay in my family's guest house. I told her I'd rather we didn't, and when she pressed as to why I cobbled together some poor excuse about mountain lion problems on the property. A week had gone by and my girlfriend still wanted to make the trip. My parents understood my reservations with the guest house, but felt I should grow up and get over the issues I had with the place. If we would be staying in the guest house, I had to come clean to my girlfriend about it. So on the drive to Oregon, I told her about the summer my family spent in the guest house trying to cure my uncle of lycanthropy. I hope this story is relevant to this board and your interests. On June 19th, my parents received a phone call in the middle of the night. They came into my room, woke me, dressed me, and loaded me into the back of the car. They told me my Uncle Red would be in town and that we'd be spending the summer camping. My parents' house is roughly a 45-minute drive along Highway 45 to their guest house on Mount Hood. The guest house is what it's called now, but it had been the home my grandparents lived and raised their kids in. They left the house to their kids, who shared it amongst themselves in the form of a guest vacation home for family members visiting from out of state or for anyone who wanted to spend a weekend at Timberline Lodge skiing. I had fallen asleep on the drive to the house, but woke up to my aunt. Not Red's wife, he was single, opening the door and unbuckling me. My two other uncles sat on the front steps, both smoking and animated while they talked to my parents. My aunt led me past them and around to the back French doors which opened into the kitchen. The doors to the family room had been closed and chained. From inside I could hear people yelling and the cries of my uncle while he pleaded for help. His voice cracked, he stuttered and choked while he cried for someone to do something. My aunt locked us in one of the upstairs rooms along with her two kids who sat in the corner of the room by the fireplace crying. My aunt reassured us everything would be okay, that Uncle Red is just sick and he'd be better tomorrow. The sounds of my uncle screaming and crying kept us all awake. We finally fell asleep once the sun came up. I didn't sleep long. I woke to an empty room and the smell of breakfast and the sounds of my family talking downstairs. I got out of bed and made my way into the kitchen. I felt like I had awakened from a bad dream, like the sounds from last night hadn't happened at all. My family sat around the table laughing and eating, and I mean everyone. Uncle Red leaned against the island drinking his coffee and talking with my dad. I had no idea what had happened. Tired and confused by the situation, I broke down and cried. My mom scooped me up and carried me back upstairs. Lycanthropy means different things to different people, but to me, it meant that once a month my uncle would get sick, and sometimes he'd be so sick my family needed to chain him to a post so he wouldn't hurt himself or anyone else. My mom took me upstairs and explained this to me in a more child-friendly manner. She sat me down and established the rules of the house. These rules only applied at night. Once the sun started to set, the kids had to be brought inside and taken upstairs. We were to keep the bedroom door locked, but should open it for anyone other than Uncle Red. Don't go outside unsupervised, and no matter how much Uncle Red begs, we must not unchain him from the post. Not every night would be the same for Uncle Red. Some nights I'd wake to the sounds of him screaming and howling, the panicked yells of my uncles and my parents. Other nights would be quiet and peaceful. None of us knew what would trigger the urges in him, and I don't honestly think he knew either. For the most part, I don't think he remembered much of what happened when the wolf brain took over. But once he described the pre-blackout feeling to my mom being a bubbling sensation. I feel bad now thinking back on the situation because we would avoid talking or looking at Uncle Red. He scared us, and neither my cousins nor I knew how to process our feelings about him. Until that summer, a visit from Uncle Red meant fishing trips, hiking, fun in the great outdoors, but things had changed and Uncle Red knew that. The longer we stayed in the guest house, the more withdrawn from us he'd become. I don't think we realized the true effect this would have on him until the 4th of July. The 4th of July would be the first night we'd stay out past sundown. My Uncle Dan had made a supply run into town and brought back fireworks, nothing big or showy. Small ones. Uncle Red spent most of the day to himself, assuring everyone he felt fine, better than he'd felt since he'd got here. Night came and Uncle Dan got out the fireworks. We had polished off a pack of Whistling Pete's when my aunt lost sight of Uncle Red. While everyone had been preoccupied, he managed to slip off into the woods. My aunt gathered my cousins and I together while everyone else searched for him. My aunt led us into the house, through the front door, and towards the stairway. Uncle Red had come in through the back French doors, hunched over, pawing at his head. We ran upstairs and locked the door behind us. Huddled in the corner of my aunt's bed, we listened to Uncle Red scratch at the door. He'd mumble and groan before he would slam himself against the door. His moans and whimpers devolved into screams. The rest of the family heard the sounds and rushed inside. Soon Uncle Red was detained and tied back to his post. I left the house the next day. My parents sent me to stay with some friends who had moved out of town, and I was not to talk about my time in the guest house. I haven't seen Uncle Red since, and to be honest with you, I have no interest. I think the wolf in Uncle Red's brain meant to eat us that night. My girlfriend and I stayed in the house, and so much time had passed I barely recognized the place. The family had redecorated the whole house and had begun renting it out to skiers. I still don't know how to feel about my experience, but writing this out has helped me process things better. I hope wherever my uncle is that he's safe and protected.
Unrelated, but I saw my uncle's ghost right around the time he died. Late last year. Uncle finds out he has cancer. Fast forward a few months. Treatments aren't working. Seems like only a matter of time. My mom and uncle are very close. He basically raised her growing up. Their dad walked out and mom worked full-time. She's taking his illness very hard. Visits him at the hospital almost every day, every week, for months. I hear her crying in her room a lot. Feels bad man.jpg. I'm not close to my uncle at all. But I'm worried about my mom. Never seen her like this. One day before work. 9 a.m. Mom is at the hospital again. I'm alone in the house. Finishing my coffee. Glance out the window. It looks out into the backyard. Uncle is right there. I almost spit out my coffee. Blink a few times in disbelief. He's standing there looking right at me. I watched him for a good 5 seconds. Then my phone dings. Startles me. Glance down. New text message. Look back out the window. Uncle is gone. Open the phone and read text. It's from my mom.
My brother just died. Please pray for me.
Not sure why I of all people saw him. When I told my mom, she started crying.
Here's some of the shit my uncle went through after he got out. Leading up to his death. Uncle was in 11 degrees Celsius airborne apparently. Tours in Kuwait and Panama. Got married. but he had serious trouble readjusting to civilian life. Marriage fell apart. Uncle hit a downward spiral. Dad said he was really awful for a while, and everyone was worried he'd eventually off himself. His son, my cousin, ultimately joined the military too. He was even worse than my uncle at one point. Cousin attempted self-end and ended up hospitalized with TBI and PTSD. This fucked with my uncle more than he already was. But he obviously couldn't in Hero since he had kids, so he had to figure out other ways of dealing with his issues. On a personal note, he was a great uncle to me. Even with how clearly troubled he was, I've never met a more compassionate man in my life. Anyway, after Cousin's attempted self-end, Uncle somehow manages to meet a woman and remarries. Also learning carpentry, building houses to keep himself sane. But he's always in excruciating pain from military injuries. His knee and back. He's told that if he doesn't get surgery, he'll be paralyzed by the end of the year. The VA's jerking him around about his benefits, so Uncle can't afford his surgery. The thought of becoming paralyzed really fucks with him. Uncle hits a new downward spiral. Just before his death, Uncle's behavior becomes seriously erratic. Okay, so that's the gist of everything he went through. Now here's what I was told happened just before he died. Uncle always keeps a pistol on him. Some nights he, my aunt, and my cousin will be eating dinner and Uncle will pull out his pistol and hold it to his head. Aunt and cousin freak out and tell him to put the gun down, but Uncle doesn't seem to hear them. He does this a lot. One day, cousin comes home early, being quiet in case Uncle is asleep. But he hears Uncle talking in his room. He listens. Sounds like Uncle is having a conversation with someone. Cousin assumes he's on the phone, but he overhears.
You're going to make me do it. I don't want to. I love my family.
Cousin's concerned, knocks on Uncle's door and opens it. He's just sitting on the edge of the bed. Cousin asks, "Who are you talking to?"
Nobody. Leave me alone.
Cousin tells my mom and dad about this. Mentions how sometimes Uncle's eyes will glaze over and he'll put the gun to his head. Fast forward. Uncle is in the garden. Aunt comes home. She says something to him. Uncle follows her into the house. He tells her, "I killed a man." She says, "WTF are you talking about?" He repeats the same thing. "I killed a man," and walks to his room where his gun is. Walks back out, holding the gun up in the air and says, "I killed him and he won't leave me alone." Aunt freaks out. Starts screaming, thinking Uncle's going to kill her. Uncle puts the gun under his chin. Before he does this, Uncle says something to my aunt. She never tells anybody what it is. Only thing she ever said to my dad was, "I don't think that was him pulling the trigger." Funeral was held after the plague hit. Uncle couldn't have the full military honors he should have had. We couldn't invite friends or even much family. But they played taps, and my dad and cousin folded the flag. We sang Amazing Grace and Dad cried. His eyes were so fucking far away as he sang. He looked the same way when I found him this morning crying. Like I said, I'm not a military guy. But this shit really drove home the fact that some soldiers don't leave the war. It doesn't end for them, even when it's supposed to be over.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember that all videos have been archived on the Odyssey page.